This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Today's show kicks off with a conversation from K-State's Jenny Ifft, Cornell University's Wendong Zhang, and The Ohio State University's Seungki Lee as they discuss how tariffs can disrupt states differently across the U.S. Wendong and Seungki continue the show as they share examples of how states could be impacted uniquely and what neighbors usually contribute to the most concern. K-State Extension horticulture expert Matt McKernan ends today's show explaining what can be done to control spring weeds as the warmer weather and spring rains have helped lawns and weeds grow. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Thursday show discussing uneven state-level exposure to potential U.S. tariffs. And then to talk about this, we're joined by Associate Professor at Cornell University in the Dyson School, Wendong Zhang, and Assistant Professor of Farm Management at The Ohio State University, Seungki Lee. And we are also joined by K-State Flinchbaugh Agricultural Policy Chair and host of the Smoke and Mirrors podcast, Jenny Ifft. Wendong, Seungki, Jenny, I appreciate you all taking the time to join us today.
Great to be here.
So, talking about this paper titled Uneven State-Level Exposure to Potential U.S. Tariff Disputes with Canada and Mexico. And what is the story behind this paper?
So let me start. I think the main story is that tariffs may be national policy, but they do not affect evenly across the country. So we want to move beyond like national trade numbers and ask a more practical question, like which states are more exposed through which commodities and through which supply chain channels. As hinted at in the title, like one of the main findings is that like exposure differs quite a bit across the states. I think that's kind of the key punchline of this paper.
I want to add a bit about my personal experiences. I worked in the heartland in Iowa, the Iowa State for 7 years, where the corn and soybean and hog exports are really important. Now I'm working at Cornell in New York State. Virtually, except for the dairy sector, many producers who produce fruits and vegetables, they sell their products in New York City. They feel way less involvement with international trade. When they think about trade, they actually are not thinking about export losses as, Iowa or Kansas farmers. They think about competition, that they think about the threats of their markets being taken away by Peruvian or Mexican avocados or other fruits, right? So across the different states that you will see drastic differences in agriculture, and this represents a part of the strengths of the U.S. agricultural economy, actually. And I personally feel that we sometimes are too focused only on soybean, while ignoring that we have a lot of export potentials in the coastal states in thinking about global markets for these fruits and vegetables and dairy products, consumer products, but also, ignoring the farmers who often don't necessarily feel international markets are only their export destinations.
Could you give an example of a state that's a major agricultural state that's highly affected, and then maybe one that is less affected? I think exposed is the term you use.
I think that the Iowa is probably the poster child when it comes to exposure, because Iowa leads the nation in soybean, corn, and hog production. And many of these sectors and ethanol as well. So the DDGS, which is a feed grain, that the byproducts when you are turning corn into ethanol, that you will also have this feed grain. So that's often exported as well. So a lot of the products that Iowa farmers grow essentially are sold to the national market. That the saying is that if you're thinking about all the soybeans grown in Iowa, more than half are sold to international buyers. 1 in every 4 rows are sold to China. right? So when U.S. have trade war with China, especially, this really affects the significant chunk of your market. When you lose your number one buyer of soybeans, even all your other buyers step up and buy more, they will not be able to make up all your loss. So I was one of the poster child for really heavy export exposure. New York and some of the northeastern states, because that a lot of the products, for example, are much smaller farms and they're growing for farmers markets. They're going to Boston. They're going to New York City's market. They are not necessarily typically involved in the trade war. Although that this year we are seeing that the spat between U.S. and Canada interestingly drag them into the unfamiliar territories.
And while you mention that, I feel like a lot of times we talk about just the overall impact for farmers or ranchers. And so why did you find it important to go down to that state level and look at agricultural trade and tariffs?
Well, I think a couple of reasons. First of all, when we actually mapped the data and see how actually trades are happening across the states, we see quite a bit of difference between the states because depending on the production strength, some states are of course exporting a lot of fruits and vegetables. Some states like Ohio, Iowa, Illinois, this Corn Belt states are primarily producing a lot of corn, soybeans. So depending on that, we see really different kind of trade flows and how they are shipped to outside countries. And also when you look at the import side, it is also quite different. It is when it comes to just importing values, we actually import a lot of processed food and beverages, but also depending on where you are located at, it's also showing very, very different numbers and pictures. So it's actually very meaningful to look at the details of what's happening, and then it can actually hint us how all the trade discussion we are looking at these days that can potentially affect actually our maybe daily business within the states where you are located at.
So through my discoveries of the Canadian wine, that these spatial levels also matter even beyond the United States. If you think about why we care about within a country, that we learned, for example, the people in Quebec speak French, and the ban on U.S. liquor and beer doesn't matter for them that much because they're buying French and Italian wine anyway. But for someone who lives in Ontario, they're importing a lot of things from the U.S., but because of geographical proximity, they are buying a lot more from New York State because it's just across the border, right? So I think that these are some of the reasons that not only what you are good at producing, but also whether you are close and it's easier to transport, and whether there are some historical connection will all affects your different exposure and what kind of products you're buying or selling.
You've made the mention of Iowa multiple times and all the trade that they're doing. Can there be states that maybe aren't the largest agricultural producing and trading states still being highly exposed and impacted?
Well, I would pick Louisiana because I think that's actually what we documented in the paper. And interestingly, maybe this is actually one of the pitfall when reading the data set, because data is not really tracking down all the commodity flows, and sometimes it just missed something stored in states and then processed. So Louisiana is kind of a typical place that is not producing as much as Iowa or other states, but maybe it turned out that it is actually the largest exporting states in the southern part of this country because of this location advantage. So a lot of things are just came into the Louisiana and then processed. So when you think about then if we are having maybe escalated tension with Mexico, then probably Louisiana might be actually seeing much bigger impact than what people might expect, because even though they are not producing, they are already getting a lot of economic values and generating it through processing the food, storing it. So all this kind of a service that they are providing as a main hub of the exports, they're going to lose that opportunity. So it's pretty clear what's going to happen afterwards if that happens.
I have to admit that I worked in Iowa for 7 years, so a lot of the statistics in Iowa are hardwired into my brain. And Seungki went to Iowa State for PhD. I think we have to say that we have a bias for Iowa.
As we've been talking about agricultural tariffs and trade, I feel like we've been focusing towards exports, but do we need to take a look at imports as well?
Yeah, I think so. It's of course worthwhile to check like how import values are distributed across the states so that we can read potential exposure to like, maybe tariffs, especially if our like maybe trade partners are imposing kind of countervailing like tariffs, then probably we might be seeing some of the possible like exposure of this shock. So it's still kind of what if kind of scenario analysis or exercise. So it's somewhat like hypothetical at this moment because we are not seeing that very like immediate shocks imposed at this moment. But still, like yeah, that's true. Like we are reading like many, especially I think when you look at the Midwest. Of course, we are importing quite a bit of like fertilizer, especially potash from Canada. So this is going to be maybe a very obvious like subject of matter, like when it comes to the retaliation happens by our trade partners. And of course, I think some other, I think importing side, like maybe especially like fruits and vegetable, like coming through many southern states, they will be also like be like impacted once like Mexico or other like countries like exporting their fruits and vegetable to the US are imposing some of the maybe retaliation as well as if we raise our tariff on that on those kind of products as well. I think many of these are still exempted and we are not really putting these tariffs exercised. So I don't think they are currently very effectively like changing this picture, but things can change at any time. So I think that's my 2 cents.
We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll be continuing this conversation with Seungki, Wendong, and Jenny. We're now cutting to that short break. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing an article titled Uneven State-Level Exposure to Potential U.S. Tariff Disputes with Canada and Mexico. And once again, and to talk about this, we're joined by Associate Professor at Cornell University, Wendong Zhang, Assistant Professor of Farm Management at The Ohio State University, Seungki Lee, and K-State Flensburg Agricultural Policy Chair and host of the Smoke and Mirrors podcast, Jenny Ifft. As we continue talking about agricultural tariffs, is there special attention needed when we're thinking about our neighbors of Canada and Mexico?
I think so. I think actually this makes our article like a little more timely because this year, like July 1st is actually like where we will have to have the joint review process for USMCA. So this is actually a mandatory review, and this is kind of a sunset clause. So if we just like agree and renew it, then we can actually renew this USMCA system for the next maybe few decades, I guess. We can continue that basically. But if we do not, then it's going to be giving us maybe just 10-year expiration time. So after 2036, USMCA system will not be existing anymore. So, and maybe during this process, especially this joint review, probably we might see maybe some of the commodities might be like under like review and eventually changed, I guess, because I think now we are really restructuring our supply chain system through these tariff changes. So probably that's going to be affecting this USMCA joint review process as well. And I think our paper is kind of telling this is going to be the pre-liberation date, like reference point that we could see in the past, and then maybe we can compare that to today's changed supply chain.
Could you dig a little bit into how integrated our broader agri-food input supply chains are? Just that, I mean, yeah, we send a lot of our feed grains to Mexico. They send us avocados, but I think it goes a lot deeper than that, right?
So one of the thing is that even if you think about the hog and livestock production, a lot of the antibiotics and vitamins are coming from overseas as well. So a lot of the inputs and primarily coming from China. And if we think about a lot of the crop producers, the fertilizers impacted are coming from Russia, Canada, Ukraine, right? So there are many inputs, and many inputs are potentially coming from overseas that you never really think about where it's originally coming from. And when you have large trade disputes that people are confronted with uncertainties and to really think about like all the different components that make their farm work, right? And so they find the exposure not only on the final products, even though you are selling something that you will sell to the global markets, but also for many of the inputs are potentially having some process, as I mentioned, the piglets coming from Canada, potentially, right? So, and there are something that is especially challenging is the uncertainty because the many firms and farms that when seeing the potential rising tensions between U.S. and China are thinking about how do I structure my production in maybe in the friend-shoring or near-shoring in neighboring Canada or Mexico. But now, as we show, if there's a potential, tariff or economic trace back between the North American partners, that really disrupts your several years of plan to hedge against the potential economic uncertainty, right? Then you're really at a loss of you don't know what to do.
And adding one more thing is sometimes we actually miss like the production side. So for instance, like livestock farmers, ranchers, they think like everything is just produced within the states, but sometimes we actually import quite a bit of like calves and like live cattle from Mexico and Canada. Actually, these two countries are just the only sources that we are importing these live cattle. And especially Mexico is like more than I think 70 to 80% of this live cattle source that we are importing outside of the country. So like during this, like from last year, like this New World screwworm outbreak is really disrupting the supply chain of that side. And eventually this is kind of ripple through our like cattle production and livestock supply chain and partially affecting the corn feed demand as well. So it seems somewhat distanced, but at the end, actually they are all interconnected. So I actually want to emphasize that as well.
And thinking specifically about our agricultural producers, are there impacts that really only they would be feeling right now?
Well, I think it could be impacting them in a multifaceted way because I think sometimes farmers actually struggle with like higher input cost because of like fertilizer and other like many farm inputs, and usually like they are very much like inextricably connected with energy cost as well. So when it comes to just all this tariff discussion, it's not just raising very particular commodities, but overall like price levels are going up. Then many like farmers and like ranchers and like even like food processors, they are like from the big picture perspective, they are all the kind of middleman. So to some extent, they are feeling the margin squeeze issues anyway. Especially like when you look at soybean farmers, they are, I think, one of the groups that are feeling like very, very like high risk of the margin squeeze these days because like soybean prices are like not very bullish, but also like all input costs are going up. Then this like the struggling export market is one of the drivers making their margin squeezed. So I think it is not just like price or not just cost, but sometimes it's just actually manifested by just two-side squeezing issue. So I think that's one of the nature that we are seeing like by this tariff pressure.
Another thing I think is that the farmers use a lot more fuel, right? So if we think about the current conflicts in Iran, that everyone is feeling the higher fuel cost, but it's because that the fuel used by farmers and ranchers are a lot more. So the impacts is disproportionate. And also that we often think about the annual crop farmers, corn and soybean, but there are also the perennial crop farmers who they need to make a decision whether I grow, grape or not, or nuts or not. And these investments take years to see the fruition. And so I actually need to know what the markets look like to make these decisions. And these disruption can really mess up their decision making and make like several years, multi-million-dollar investments into a very big gamble as opposed to a potentially informed decision.
When we're thinking about this paper that you guys worked on and wrote titled Uneven State Level Exposure to Potential U.S. Tariff Disputes with Canada and Mexico, what are the key takeaways and what points would you really like our producers to maybe just keep in mind?
Well, to me, I think the main takeaway is that like tariff exposure is not just one size like fits all like kind of shock. So maybe like policymakers and like extension professionals should first identify the channel of exposure, like whether like their states are more like maybe likely to have export losses or like import cost shocks or like input cost shocks or even food price shocks. So I think depending by reading like which aspects are the most vulnerable part of their state economy when it comes to this tariff discussion, I think they can actually make a little more strategic action plans. And then that will really, I think, give them a little more informed decisions. And sometimes they can actually make some collective actions so that they can at least mitigate these shocks and then make the system a little more resilient to these potential shocks.
I want to expose my Iowa bias again. I think the perspective and the narrative in the media typically is too focused on soybeans, and our analysis shows that there's so much variation across states, across sectors, and the farmers and ranchers, when have the opportunity to talk with your representative, to talk with reporters. We need the avocado story, we need the apple story, we need the berry story, we need the livestock story, in addition to the soybean story, because your perspective and your states matters as well. And it's a very complicated issues, and but often whenever there's trade disputes, big or small, agriculture tends to be the retaliation targets, unfortunately. So this is not the first time, unfortunately won't be the last time as well.
Wendong, Seungki, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
That was Associate Professor at Cornell University in the Dyson School, Wendong Zhang, and he was joined by Assistant Professor of Farm Management at The Ohio State University, Seungki Lee, and K-State Flinchbaugh Agricultural Policy Chair and host of the Smoke and Mirrors podcast, Jenny Ifft. If you'd like to read this paper titled Uneven State-Level Exposure to Potential U.S. Tariff Disputes with Canada and Mexico, I will link it in today's show notes on agtoday.net. If you did only catch the second part of this conversation, there is the first segment, which you can also check out by going to agtoday.net. There is also, once again, more content to this conversation, which you can check out on the Smoke and Mirrors podcast. That episode will be going out next week, which is the week of May 4th. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead.
Welcome back, and thanks for joining us on Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. Unfortunately, weeds are a common sight in Kansas in early spring. With many parts of Kansas recently receiving a fair amount of rainfall, there's a good possibility that more weed activity may follow. K-State Extension horticulture expert Matt McKernan says that spring weed control often includes the lawn, home landscape, and vegetable gardens.
Yeah, as we start to warm up and get more spring rains, oftentimes that means a lot of things are starting to grow and really take off, and that's especially true for some of the weeds or undesirable plants that pop up in our lawns, landscapes, and vegetable gardens.
A lot of times it seems like we see this after a rain, so that's one of those things that kind of feeds the weeds?
Yeah, a lot of the weeds that we're seeing this time of year are what we call cool season weeds, and that means they actually started to grow from seed all the way back last fall. And they sit either as tiny plants or just beginning to grow plants all through the winter months. And so as we start to get warmer temperatures and essentially start to get a lot more moisture that they need to grow, their growth just explodes, and we start to see all kinds of flowers and bloom from those spring weeds as well.
And sometimes we actually don't know that it's necessarily a weed because sometimes it does look like it could be some type of ground cover.
Yeah. Basically, any weed is just going to be a plant that's out of place. So some people may have a higher tolerance for a certain type of plant than others. Some people may have a lower tolerance for that same plant. And so what we consider a weed is going to vary from person to person and situation to situation. It may be a problem up by your front door, but areas in the back of the landscape or the back of the property, that same plant may not be as much of a concern. And so when we're thinking about whether or not to control that weed or that plant, it's always really important to start with proper identification of what that plant is in order to determine what we might need to do about it or maybe not do about it.
That's a good point because we may treat a dandelion different than henbit.
Exactly. And henbit is going to be probably one of the most predominant weeds that people see this time of year. Most people know henbit for its purple flowers that you see in the landscape. If you look up close on henbit, though, it's typically always going to have a square stem, which is unique for a lot of weeds. And when you look at the leaves, they're typically going to be kidney-shaped and attached directly to that square stem.
You mentioned that a lot of this starts in the fall, so if we didn't do anything in the fall, we're going to see them in the spring. What happens in the spring? What can we do at that point?
Yeah, so it's important to realize that with all of these spring weeds, whether it's henbit, whether it's chickweed, even weeds like little barley, all of those weeds are actually going to die out when we get to the summer heat. So the longer and longer we wait to do something about it, it may be better to do nothing at all. Because as we start to get into the summer heat, the heat is going to be the end of the life cycle of these plants, and so they're going to die off and essentially go back to not being there until next fall. So this time of year, waiting out that weed is absolutely an appropriate option for control or dealing with that weed. But we can also always hand pick, and sometimes we can also consider spot treatments of those weeds as necessary as well.
We want to make sure that we're not killing the lawn in the process.
Absolutely. So it's always really important to read the product label of any kind of herbicide that you might look for weed control. More and more, many herbicides have products that will kill weeds or kill plants for many months. And so we want to make sure that the products we choose are safe on the area that we're going to apply it. So it's either labeled for the vegetable garden or labeled for the specific type of turf grass that you have. Then we also want to make sure that we look at the section that's the planting interval, or essentially how long from when that product is applied to when it's safe to replant with either new grass seed, new flowers, whatever the case may be.
If we miss the opportunity to do a pre-emergent this spring, is there anything else we can do?
Yeah, a lot of weeds are able to be controlled with post-emergent products, essentially after that weed starts to grow. There are products that can be used to apply them. I think more importantly for a lot of our spring weeds like the henbit and chickweed, it's important that we mark our calendars for this fall to be able to put down those pre-emergents at the appropriate time to prevent those weeds from coming up and being a problem next spring without as many herbicides or other products necessary to control them.
That's K-State Extension horticulture expert Matt McKernan with information on early spring weed control. To learn more about using pre- and post-emergence to control weeds, contact your local county or district extension office. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.